Good evening, everyone. This is an attire seminar hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. My name is Ralph Borland. I'm a researcher here. The research strand that I'm in is a Carnegie-funded research project into the future of hospitals in Africa, including artificial intelligence. And we host other research groups as well. Our guest here this evening is Ziauddin Sardar, and we're really privileged to have Zia here talking about post-normal times. I first came across Ziauddin's work in 2019, a few years ago, when I was asked to write a paper for the Journal of Futures Studies. And my colleagues Stuart Candy and Jose Ramos, who's the editor of the Journal of Future Studies, sent me some of Zia's work, and I was particularly taken by some of the ideas about decolonizing the future in terms of the work that I was doing. And I'd first heard about future studies probably 20 years ago when I was introduced to it as a master's student at NYU. And at that time, I was introduced to future studies as this instrumental predictive field that was used mainly by businesses to predict the future for their interests. And what Stuart and Jose pointed out to me with a series of texts, including some of Zia's, was the idea of critical futures, about critical ways of imagining how different groups would predict the future and how different futures exist. So that was my entry point to Zia's work. And then since then, I've been in a conversation with Zia over the past few months and looking more into Zia's work on post-normal times. So Zia is a writer and a cultural critic, and he's editor of the quarterly publication Critical Muslim, as well as being former professor of law and society at Middlesex University in the UK. And he's a columnist on New Statesman.
I used to be a columnist in the newspaper.
Used to be.
I've given up all my journalism now.
Great, thank you. And you've written over 50 books.
Yes.
Yeah, on a wide range of subjects. And now you are director of the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. Yeah. And post-normal times and post-normal times theory is, where your energy really is at the moment. And that's what you are coming to speak to us about today. And before the seminar, we've shared links to material, your website, which hosts a lot of material, as well as some particular texts around it. So without saying much more about it, we'll discuss this more after your presentation. I'd like to give the floor to you, and you have a presentation, and please talk us through your ideas.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Let me share the screen. Hang on, let me just, where are we? Oh. Okay.
Looks good.
So it looks good, right. So thank you very much for your introduction, Ralph. As Ralph said, I am the director of the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies, which is.
Zia, just one thing is you did have it on the presentation mode a second ago, but now it's gone. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that all right?
There you go. Perfect. Oh,
yeah.
Now it's gone back again.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yes.
I'm the director of the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies, which is essentially a network of people who work on futures literacy. We promote futures literacy, particularly in minority communities, disadvantaged communities, and we work on post-normal times theory, which is the theory of change, essentially. So this is the introduction to post-normal times. It's about how do we understand change, but also how do we appreciate the changing nature of change. It's not that just change is changing, that things are becoming faster and faster, as I will point out, but the nature of change itself is changing. And post-normal times attempts to try and grapple the nature of this changing, the changing nature of change. So if you just cast your back, what I'm going to do is to take you through events of the last few years. So in 1926, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year was post-truth. Now, these words are very carefully chosen. They are actually words that describe the zeitgeist, what is the spirit of the time at the moment. So in 2006, when Oxford Dictionaries chose post-truth as the word of the year, they were actually saying that this is the spirit of the time, that we have moved into a new era where post-truth has become the dominant theme. Couple of years later, their word of the year was toxic. That is not just that we are moving towards post-truth age, but that this particular age is tending to be toxic. There are lots of elements of social strife, political uncertainty, and so on and so forth, which make contemporary times toxic. Then, during that period, we also had a very unusual event, which became a global event. Actually, it was just an event that concerned Britain and European Union, Brexit. The European Union was basically formed to make sure that what has happened in European history does not repeat itself. And it never occurred to the European Union that those who would join it, and it is not easy to join the European Union, as many Eastern European countries have found out, would never imagine that they will actually leave it. But for the first time in the history of the European Union, 50 years, a particular country decided to leave the European Union, and it was a very messy divorce. In fact, it is still continuing. So that was a very unusual event. I'm not sure what is going on here.
That's fine. Yeah.
And then at the same time, of course, we had two people who, if you like, the champions of post-truth. So for 4 years, the United States was ruled by a man who was known as a confirmed liar. And we in Britain also had a prime minister who was renowned for lying and even now in recent news, Britain is being described as a very corrupt country. There's lots of lies and fabrication going on. So it's not just that Oxford Dictionary chose a word, post-truth, but we could actually see the manifestation of that word in political life. So here is very famous.
It's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth.
Truth is truth. I don't mean to go like.
No, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth.
Truth isn't truth. This is going to become a bad meme.
Don't do this to me.
So truth isn't truth. This is very interesting because since the times of the Greek, we have regarded truth as an absolute given. It's an absolute. We believe in truth, but now suddenly we are in an age where truth does not really matter. And in fact, there are a host of books on post-truth and how it has shaped society in the last in the last few years. All of them actually basically point out that it's not just that people lie, but that lie have been instituted in society. Lies have been instituted in political life, in social interaction, in cultural phenomena, that lies have become deeply embedded in society. But at the same time, we've had a number of technological development. The most common, of course, is artificial. One of the most important is artificial life, and we can see the creation of artificial life. Again, we have regarded life as sacrosanct, but now we are kind of on the verge of actually creating artificial life. So scientists in the US have succeeded in kind of developing a synthetic life in the laboratory. So that's a kind of pretty major advance in science, if you like, but also mind-boggling and one that challenges our conventional notion of what is life. And at the same time, we are having some very interesting developments in in
Just
warfare.
like any mobile device these days, it has cameras and sensors, and just like your phones and social media apps, it does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of chic explosive. This is how it works. Did you see that?
That was a real advertisement for a real weapon. And we are developing a whole variety of new weapons, which take warfare into a totally different level. I mean, if you've seen the Boston Dynamics robots, you know, the robots, the fighting robots, they are incredibly fighting machines. And they do remind us of the Terminator of the original film, you know, a Terminator that never gives up. Once it decides, it's been programmed to decide what target it has to terminate, it consistently carries on till it fulfills its task. And that kind of weapons are just around the corner. And as I said, that was a real advertisement for a real weapon. Then, of course, the virus arrived, right? Now, we've had quite a few pandemics in the past, and the most famous is the 1920, flu pandemic that killed a number of millions of people, in fact. But this pandemic was somewhat different. It did not only make people sick in hospital, but it had a phenomenal impact in almost every other sphere of life. So, for example, travel stopped. Shopping stopped. Nobody went to the shopping malls. Shopping malls were empty and closed down. Theaters and entertainment stopped. Pilgrimage to Mecca stopped. First time in history, the Saudis had to kind of stop pilgrims from coming to perform the Hajj. Normally, you get up to 3 million pilgrims every year. In 2020, there were virtually none. This year, there will be very, very few. So religious ceremonies stopped, prayers in mosques stopped, the churches closed, the synagogues were closed down. So religious life, religious communal life came to a standstill. It was as though the time had stopped, but the clock had carried on ticking. So that's a pandemic that we've never had a pandemic that had such a global impact on so many aspects of our lives. In that sense, the COVID-19 pandemic was a kind of unique event. But along with the pandemic, all sorts of other diseases started coming out, and many we did not even hear about. This one, the deadly fungi. Many people in India, for example, died not just of COVID, but also this fungi which developed later on. It became a major kind of epidemic in India of, associated with COVID-19. But there were other related diseases as well. We know COVID-19 has different variations, right? And there are other viruses as well, which interacted with it, and some of which we know something about, and some of which we know very, very little about. And then in the last 10 years, there has been a phenomenal rise of far-right movements. Now, as I said earlier on, the European Union was formed with the premise and the promise that the Holocaust, for example, will never happen again. But now we are in a strange situation where European Union, a bastion of democracy and freedom, et cetera, is now an incubator of far-right movement. So almost 1/3 of the members in the European Parliament actually belong to far-right parties. And in some countries in Europe, far-right is in power, for example, Hungary or Poland. In other countries, far-right controls quite a large swathe of society. So in France, for example, 1 in 3 people vote for National Front. In Germany, one in 4 or 5 vote for Dutch alternative, as it's called, German alternative movement. And in certain countries, we see the far right movement actually coming into parliament and being very strongly represented in parliament. So that's a very interesting, strange phenomenon. But also, this is not just happening in Europe. We know, for example, that India is essentially governed by a neo-fascist party. That in Brazil, fascism is well established, Barcelona and what have you. So fascism is making a major comeback, right, against the grain of history, if you like, in a sense. So that's a new and frightening development, which basically did not exist 10, 15 years ago. This is Greenland, and normally when you see a photograph like that, it will be covered with ice, and huskies will be, sliding across ice. So we now see the impact of climate change. It's 10, 15 years ago, we would have said climate change is, is happening, is going to happen. But now we are actually living through climate change, which is something that we can witness every day, in a sense. And at the same time, temperatures are shooting up. In Pakistan, where I grew up, in the city of Karachi, last year the temperature was 49 degrees. In certain parts in Kuwait, it was 52 degrees. In certain parts of Africa and Middle East, the temperatures have reached to a level where it is not possible for human beings to actually live in that. And of course, and we also know that this is going to cause a great deal of migration, and where will these people live if they cannot live in their own cities, in their own country, and because temperature makes it practically impossible for them to survive. And hurricanes are coming. Again, we've always had hurricanes, but now for the first time, they seem to come in clusters. This is 4 hurricanes coming one after the another, moving towards United States. And that's, again, a kind of unusual phenomenon. That's something that has not happened. I mean, we've had, problems with the weather throughout history, but this simultaneous occurrence of flooding, of fires, hurricanes appearing in clusters, that's something that has not happened. In Philippines 3 or 4 years ago, I've forgotten the name of the hurricane. The hurricane was actually traveling faster than the Japanese fast train, well over 250 miles an hour. You can imagine the consequences of such a hurricane. That's also a kind of almost a unique event in history. And of course, wildfires. I mean, last year, half of Australia was under fire. Half of Australia. There are photographs from space that show half of Australia is and then there have been fire in California, in Greece, in Turkey, of unprecedented scale. This is what's happening in the Nile.
This is the majestic Nile, the world's longest river, crucial to the survival of millions of people. But now the river's existence is threatened like never before.
Everywhere you walk, it's all plastic.
For the first time, we reveal the full extent of plastic pollution across 5 countries.
All of this,
all of this,
large parts of it, then have been
washed out.
straight down.
This is Bombay. On most days, it's practically impossible to live in the city. There's so much smog, there's so much pollution that it's not possible to actually go out during the day. It's just the whole city is being choked, and the number of deaths that occur, I mean, they're hardly recorded, but they are phenomenal in number. So cities are being transformed in an unprecedented scale. But something else is happening, is that many of the things that we used to teach some of the stuff, the disciplines themselves are being weaponized. And there's a whole plethora of books that have recently come out, how, for example, anthropology has been weaponized, how economics has weaponized inequality, how logarithms actually promote certain kind of hatred and bias. So that's also a kind of a development that has not happened in history. We always thought disciplines are something that actually teach, people they use in university to promote knowledge, but now they're becoming weaponized themselves as not so much as knowledge, but more as promoting certain ideologies. Recently, of course, we have the phenomena of biohackers, people who can hack individuals and plant DNA malware in their bodies. That's something was unimaginable. You could not imagine that 10 years ago. And now, in fact, there have been a couple of cases in the United States, and it is something that is what we call an emerging issue, which may actually develop into a trend in the near future. And not just that we are creating life in laboratory, but also we're creating all sort of chimeras. Right. So this has happened in the United States, but we know that China also is involved in creating doing this sort of research. Again, this not only redefines or forces us to think what is life, it also forces us to think what is wildlife, in a sense. And the higher education itself, this is the cover from Chronicle Review, which is a higher education newspaper in America. In January 2018, it carried this cover, which basically says that higher education is bullshit. That in fact, a great deal of what we are teaching people nowadays does not make sense. It has no real applicability in the world outside. There's something the higher education itself is becoming problematic. Not just the disciplines are being weaponized, but the content of higher education itself is becoming meaningless. So this graph shows meaningless metrics and consumer mindset. Universities are becoming businesses, right? With budget cuts, all sorts of many disciplines just promote jargon rather than communicate anything that is meaningful and that actually promotes knowledge. So about 4 or 5 years ago, the postgraduate and undergraduate students at the University of Manchester went on strike. They said we do not want to learn this economics because this economics is actually ends up promoting more inequality than equality. It's not actually solving our problems. It's actually making the problems of the world worse. So we are not going to teach this. So they came out in protests, and after 3 or 4 days of strike, the faculty also joined them. And there were long drawn-out negotiation. 2 weeks negotiation followed, and the end of the negotiation, the university authorities, vice chancellors, others reached an agreement with the leaders of the strike that they will write down what sort of economics they want to be taught, and they will actually, produce a book on it, which the University of Manchester Press will publish. So they produced this book, all of them together. I think most of the students participated. For 3 or 4 edited the book. It's called Rethinking Economics, and University of Manchester published the book, but was immediately picked up by other universities. So this is a Routledge edition of the book. And then, of course, later on, the book became so popular that it came out as Penguin paperback as well. So the students themselves are realizing there's something profoundly wrong with higher education. This has just happened in economics, and I suspect that this may happen in other disciplines as well, in the coming years. So this is an advertisement from the economists.
It's a noisy, chaotic, confusing world. If only everyone could see it more clearly, separate fake from fact. If only we all understood what's really going on. The world needs another economy.
I'm afraid the world does not need another economist, because economists are probably part of the problem, but the economist has actually diagnosed the situation very well. We are living in a very chaotic, uncertain world, and most people do not just have no understanding of what is going on. So what is going on? What exactly is happening? All these changes that I've just a few of the major changes that have happened. I've just described a few. So what exactly is going on? So you will not be surprised that many people have actually given some time, thought, and published material on it. One of the first ones to write about this was Polish-British sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, a brilliant sociologist, who said, well, we are living in liquid time. Things, solid does not exist anymore. The solid ideas, everything is fluid, and we are living in liquid time. Oh dear, I'm not sure what's going on today. No, go back. All right, so it's supposed to come one at a time, but I'm obviously having some problem. Thomas Friedman, unlike Zygmunt Bauman, who's probably left-wing, Thomas Friedman, who's a right-wing economist and columnist on the New York Times, described it as global weirding, that things are becoming more and more weird. Robert Colwell, a technology journalist, describes it as the great acceleration. And Alan Curtis, who's a BBC producer and documentary filmmaker, describes it as hypernormalization. In fact, his film called Hypernormalization, which is a 90-minute documentary, I recommend you find time to see it. It is, in fact, can be on the web somewhere, but obviously it's on BBC iPlayer. But people from other places should be able to download it. I've seen it in a number of different websites. And the geologists have got together, and they've come to the conclusion that we have left previous geological ages and now entered the new geological age, which they describe as the Anthropocene. And in the Anthropocene age, the first time in history, human activities have direct geological and ecological impact on the planet. So this is something that has never ever happened before, that over human activities as individuals, communities, states, provinces, nations, whatever we do has a direct impact on the geology and ecology of the planet, and it can actually transform it. And of course, climate change is just one manifestation of that. There are other manifestations. We have actually extended a number of different planetary boundaries. James Biddell, who's a British science journalist, described it as a new dark age. And Roger Helm, who formed the movement Extinction Rebellion, of course, argues that we are facing extinction, which is largely true. And unless we do something about it, we are not going to, we won't be able to save the planet. And Susanna Zuboff, who is a economist at MIT, describes it as the age of surveillance capitalism. This is a huge book. All of these are books, except Alan Curtis, which is a documentary that you can all kind of find, on the net and read. So all of these people have diagnosed it, and they've diagnosed their particular aspect of reality correctly. Susanna Zuboff, for example, looks at economics and capitalism. Robert Colwell looks at technology. Zygmunt Bauman looks at social order, etc., etc. So all of these guys are actually telling us something which is true and correct, and in many respects new in terms of what they identify, how the world is actually changing. But what they don't do is to provide us a very complete picture. Because essentially what they're looking at is what the normal situation was and how the normal situation is changing. So what I am arguing is the normal nowadays, it does not make sense at all. That now normal, whatever we took as normal, doesn't really matter how we define normal. We can spend time defining it. Doesn't matter how we define normal. The paradigms of modernity, the ideas of postmodernism, or traditional conventional ways of doing capitalist economics, whatever you see as normal. None of that normal is actually functions anymore. And we are now moving towards, well, 5-6 years ago, I would have said we are moving towards post-normal times, but now I think we are actually in post-normal times. So how do we define post-normal times? This is how I've defined it in a paper that was published in 2010, that the post-normal times is the in-between period where old orthodoxies are dying, but new ones have not yet emerged, and nothing really makes sense. So all the confusion that we see out there is because the tools we use to understand those confusions do not work anymore. And the old orthodoxies, old paradigms, old ways of knowing, old ways of doing, the conventional ways of doing, they just do not work anymore. So we find ourselves in an in-between period. This is a definition from E. Mauro, who's an Italian journalist. He was in conversation with Zygmunt Bauman, and in one of their books, I think it's called After Babel, and where he's saying we're living in an interregnum between what is no longer and what is not yet. And thus we are necessarily unstable. So there is this kind of, we are confined ourselves in no longer and not yet. Not yet has not emerged, and we don't even know what not yet will actually look like. So that's the post-normal times. It is important to realize that post-normal times is not about the end of times. It's not that we are, we are going to cease to exist, or the world is going to collapse. It's about the fact that we find ourselves in this very strange space where what we regarded as conventional and normal just does not hold water anymore. It does not work, and we are struggling to find new ways of doing things. So this brings us to post-normal change. What has introduced this change? What are the drivers of this change? What has brought us to this post-normal condition? This is a lady who I think probably became very famous in South Africa. Her name will come to me in a minute. She was flying from Los Angeles to Johannesburg, and before she got on the plane, she said, I'm going to South Africa, a land of, hope I don't get AIDS or something like that, right? So while she was actually during flight, lots of people reacted to her and were offended by her tweet. And in fact, by the time she landed in Johannesburg, there were literally millions and millions of tweets, right, asking for her to be sacked. Really, they're kind of reacting strongly to her. So what she didn't realize, and this is interesting, she was head of communication of a big corporation. So what she didn't realize that things nowadays move with great speed. She, in fact, by the time she reached Johannesburg, her directors were already discussing her dismissal. And in fact, within 3 or 4 days, or maybe a week or two after she was in Johannesburg, she was actually relieved of the lead of her job. So things move with great speed. That's one of the phenomena that a number of authors, like the Great Acceleration book, have noticed that nowadays things move with great speed. Speed is the essence, right? And they tend to be global in scope. Not just that things move fast, but they cover the entire globe because of social media, 24-hour news coverage, and lots of other things that are going on. And they can have a direct impact on an individual. So speed, scope, and scale are 3 major driving forces of what is moving us towards these post-normal times, what has brought us to these post-normal times. But there's one other category, and that was pointed out by Ban Ki-moon, who, as if you remember, was a former General Secretary of the United Nations. So Ban Ki-moon said that we are living through an era like no other. There are multiple crises: a food crisis, fuel crisis, flu crisis, and financial crisis. Each is a crisis we have not seen for many years, even generations, but this time they are hitting the world all at once. That things are not just happening in terms of speed, scale, and scope, but they are also happening simultaneously, right? So these are the four drivers of post-normal change. They are basically drivers of change that are happening nowadays out there in real world that are bringing us, or that brought us to post-normal times. In terms of speed, this is Malala. I'm sure most people recognize her. She, as you know, the background story, she was shot by the Taliban. She was a campaigner for female education in Pakistan. She was shot by the Taliban. She was brought to England, and within a year, not just she had recovered, but within a year, she had spoken at the United Nations. She had won the Nobel Prize for Peace, and she had published her autobiography. This is speed in action. And of course, you know the story of Greta Thunberg. Only 18 months ago, she was actually sitting in front of the Swedish Parliament on her own, protesting against climate change. And nowadays, of course, she's a global icon. She was here at COP in Glasgow. So things happen very, very rapidly and go global quite, rapidly. Of course, you know this is Tarana Burke. She started the Me Too movement, but she started the Me Too movement almost 12 years ago, and it didn't go very far. The reason it didn't go very far because there was no social media. There was 24-hour news was just coming up, and things didn't have an instant global impact. But then when the same tweet was issued by an actress called Alyssa Milano, then we were in a different world altogether. And Me Too became a major event very, very quickly, engulfing, Hollywood producers, film stars, actors, all sorts of people. Again, something similar happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement is pretty old, in fact, but only in the last 2-3 years it has become a major, major phenomena because of the drivers of post-normal change. Nowadays people have their camera on their mobile phone, and they can actually film events in real time and broadcast it in real time on Facebook or with some other social media, or they can just put it out very, very, very quickly on Twitter, and things spread very, very rapidly. So just a couple of examples of how the speed kind of moves things and takes it to a global level, because the changes are not just in terms of acceleration, but also in terms of scope, scale, and simultaneity. So post-normal change is then speed, scope, scale, and simultaneity. These are the factors that me and my colleagues have identified as the drivers of change. So all the books that we saw earlier on, we can actually look at them from this perspective, that essentially that's what they're talking about. But they're talking about in their own particular discipline or within their own particular area of expertise. If you step back and look at change as a whole for the bigger picture, that is the picture that emerges. So these drivers of change then take us to the experience of post-normal times, what we may call the post-normal conditions. So what is this condition? So this is I'm sorry, I don't know why, but my computer is not behaving properly today. So this is birds in flight, and they represent a kind of a complex dynamic system. They represent a complex dynamic system. And this is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional reality of Afghanistan. The US military commissioned a company called Coin Dynamics to map out all the factors that they had to consider to win the war in Afghanistan. So they came up with this map with a number of different factors, dynamic variables that are moving in time, changing all the time, like the flight of the bird, right? And if they were told that if you want to win the war, this is what you need to do. And of course, we know that they couldn't handle this because it's a very complex situation with numerous different groups of Taliban, a huge number of tribes, all sorts of foreign involvement, politics, social problems, governance, etc. And in the end, we saw what happened a few months ago when they had to leave Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is now basically on the verge of collapse. So complexity is one of the outcomes of the drivers of change, that they take us to a very complex, and things move fast in a global level, in an interconnected world, right? They produce a complex situation. And in complex situations require complex approaches to solve. It's called the law of requisite variety. You cannot solve the complex problems by simple solutions, simple approaches, or by isolating the problems. You cannot in the conventional scientific method, of course, we isolate things. Right, we do things in laboratory, but in a complex situation, you cannot isolate any component of the system because it's all interconnected and they're all variables and they're changing variables in this sense. So complexity then becomes a major outcome of the drivers of change. About 12, 13 years ago, when Britain decided to establish a Human Rights Commission, I was one of the first commissioner. I was appointed as one of the first commissioner. And part of my job was, of course, to come up with I was responsible for religion, but I also helped my colleague who was working on LGBT issues. And I basically had to deal with lesbian, gays, bisexual, and trans. There were basically, four kind of groups of people, for example, that we had to make sure that the law had treated them equally and they had equal requests, and etc. 5 years after I did my commissionership, my term ended, and a new person was appointed. So I asked him, how is he getting on, the LGBT, the person who was responsible for LGBT. He says, well, you folks had it easy, right? Because now I have to deal with lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and gender non-conforming, and other people. Now, so this is a real issue, because this is about legislation. This is about making sure that discrimination does not take place in this group. But that was 6 or 7 years ago. Today, we have to add this particular varieties of sexual orientation as well. And if you go down to the Durham University LGBT plus association, you will see all these variations, all these kind of sexual orientations. Now, this is real issue for both the university and for the LGBT association, because each of these groups get funding from the students' union for their activities, and they can only get funding, of course, if they are recognized as a legitimate group. So you can see how complex sexual orientation has become in the last 10 years. And of course, there's a great debate not just in Britain, but all over the world about transgender issues now. Are transgender women real women? Very complex question, not easy to answer. So just an example of how things are becoming more and more complex. And this complexity has real impact, and it has to, it impacts law, it impacts groups, it impacts higher education, it impacts society, it impacts entertainment, television, etc. etc. So it's not something that can be brushed aside. Now, if you have a complex system full of changing variables, you're going to have lots of contradictions. In fact, the emergence of contradictions is an indication that the system itself is becoming complex, in a sense, right? And the world now is just full of contradictions. So this is an obvious contradiction, the rich and the poor. And we know the contradiction is getting worse and worse. Oxfam publishes an annual listing of how many people actually have the most of the wealth. It started off with something like 650, 5-6 years ago. Last year, it was like 160 people have like 70-80% of the world's wealth. So that contradiction is a glaring contradiction. It has always existed, but now in post-normal times, it's becoming magnified and becoming worse and worse because of speed, scope, and scale, and simultaneity. And then, of course, if you have a complex contradictory system, there will be positive feedback. And when you get positive feedback, you have a chaotic event. And we've had a number of chaotic events. And in fact, climate change itself is now introducing many chaotic events that you have all witnessed. So the famous 2008 financial crash. But here is a chaotic event that you may not think of as a chaotic event. So this looks like either some sort of terrorist event or maybe a huge accident has happened and people are kind of running away. But basically, they are all looking for this. This is soil, and they're looking for a Pokemon. And a Pokemon, just the search for Pokemon, the instantaneous search for Pokemon, created a major chaotic event in Seoul, and everything had to stop. Sorry, go back. This doesn't do anything. These are jellyfishes, and jellyfishes are lovely creatures. They carry on. They don't bother anybody, and they carry on in their individual way, except when you increase the temperature of the sea by 2 or 3 degrees, and you also increase the salinity by a little amount. When that happens, they come together and bloom in very large number of blooms, right? So from an ordinary event, they suddenly become a chaotic phenomenon. And over the last 7-8 years, jellyfishes have caused major chaotic disturbances. They have closed down many nuclear power plants in Israel, in Philippines. Sorry, in Philippines they closed down a coal power plant. In Israel they closed a nuclear power plant, and also in various Scandinavian countries. In Philippines, because of jellyfish effects, the power stations were closed down, how the country went into darkness, and the president had to come on television, had to basically announce and say, this is not a revolution, this is just a power failure thanks to the jellyfish. The USS, is it USS Eisenhower? A major American aircraft carrier, which, by the way, had more firepower than most of the empires in history, was about to dock in Australia, in Brisbane, somewhere like that. And they had a major influx of jellyfish bloom. Jellyfish went inside the nuclear reactor, and it was touch and go, and they basically managed to stop a major disaster. And then the aircraft carrier had to limp, outside the harbor in the major kind of part of the sea, and then they had to take all the jellyfish out of the system. So jellyfish then have become a kind of, if you like, over muscat, right? That because their behavior describes the post-normal nature of war times in quite stark terms. They, as I said, they carry on with their lives without any problem unless you change certain parameters. And then when these parameters are changed, then the chaotic event takes place. So complexity, contradiction, and chaos are the three outcomes of the drivers of change that we have unleashed in contemporary times. And these four S's and 3 C's are essential basic framework of the post-normal times theory. There's a lot more there beyond that, but that's how we trying to understand what's happening in the world and how do we deal with it. So if you find yourself, in a contradictory, complex, and chaotic world, as depicted so well in the Economist advertisement that I showed you, then you cannot continue doing things the way you have always done. For one thing, as I said, complexity requires complex approaches, right? Chaotic events have two possibilities. They either cause collapse or they emerge into a new order. So you have to create a new order if you want to avoid collapse in a chaotic event. And contradictions cannot be resolved because by their nature they are logical opposite. They are contradictions, and contradictions have to be transcended. And to transcend contradictions, then you need a new way of thinking and doing, a new way of collaborating. I mean, you cannot, for example, transcend contradictions in a world based on competition. It just would not work. Only in a world based on collaboration can you transcend contradictions, right? Because you can come up with some compromise, some agreements, or what have you. So this is how we're trying to understand the nature of change the changing nature of change in contemporary times. So in conclusion, I'll simply say welcome to Post-Normal Times. And if you want more stuff, you'll find it on our website. You can download a number of papers. We published quite a lot of papers over the last 10 years. There's a special issue of World Futures Review, which only came out last month, devoted to post-normal matters. The special issue is called Post-Normal Matters. There've been a number of papers. There's a Post-Normal Times Reader that you can also download. We are actually working on Post-Normal Reader Volume 2. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I think I've taken longer than I should, but I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Zia. That's fine. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just going to pick up on one thing just to start, and we can keep open to questions and extend the seminar a bit. But I was interested in your mentioning Adam Curtis, the filmmaker, because as I was reading your text from 2009, the Welcome to Post-Normal Times, the first sentence of your abstract was, "All that was normal has evaporated. We have entered post-normal times, the in-between period," and so on. But nothing really makes sense is the way that you conclude that paragraph. And that was almost verbatim, Adam Curtis's one of Adam Curtis's statements.
Yes, he says that as well. Yes, yes,
much more
but
recent.
I wrote my paper before he made
exactly.
I wrote my paper 210, the documentary is 216 or something like that.
About 10 years earlier. No, so that's what I was drawing attention to. But
lots of people have picked up our stuff. Some have acknowledged and some have not acknowledged. But the fact is that people are seeing this.
Yes.
You see, Alan Curtis documentary specifically focused on Russia.
Yeah, so that was so Adam Curtis, what I wanted to draw attention to and put back to you was that he sees the Russian state as deliberately sowing confusion. It's to do with Putin's advisor, and so I wondered if within your post-normal times, as well as noting this as this combination of factors that are leading to this chaotic situation, if you're also looking at how certain actors are actually stimulating the production of chaos because it's in their interests.
Yeah, we don't have to go to we don't have to go to Russia. This has happened in Britain. I mean, the former advisor to Dominic, I forgot his name. Anyway, the former advisor to Boris Johnson believed in creating chaotic events, right?
Yeah.
And Brexit was created. Dominic's coming. Brexit was created. If you look at his website, it's a lot of the material. I mean, he's echoing my words in his own way, right? A lot of his activities were designed to create chaos because foolishly he thought he could control chaos. But of course, you can't control chaos at all, and you have to pay attention to the precursor of chaos, which is complexity. And to navigate complexity, you need to have complex approaches to it, in a sense. So in post-normal time theory, we always talk about navigation because there are no simple solutions. In some cases, there are no solutions at all. And therefore, you have to find your a unique way of navigating yourself out of the predicament.
Thank you, Zia. I'm going to ask people to pose their questions. I do have some questions in the chat. Robert, would you want to ask your question by voice?
I can do, Ralph.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Hi, Ziauddin. Yeah, I'm an admirer of your work over many years. I sort of stumbled on it. I'm a historian, but I've had an interest recently in Southern theory. And I wondered what you'd say about your comments that have related to global inequalities in knowledge production and different epistemes in this new period. Do you think that distinction is worth anything any longer? Has it all dissolved?
And partly it has dissolved. Well, the way I see it, that the knowledge production now is a very complex phenomenon. It's not the old-fashioned. I mean, we still have some old-fashioned objective knowledge in the Popperian sense. Yeah, but within that, there are at least 3 layers of ignorances that we need to consider. Conventionally, of course, in objective knowledge, we have kind of forgotten that there is such a thing called ignorance, and we have kind of put it aside. But ignorance now takes center stage, and it takes center stage in three ways. One is that old-fashioned plain ignorance is now much more toxic than it ever was. We are not just talking about racism, but we are now talking about eugenics. We are not just talking about lies. We are talking about fake news and deep fake. So we are talking about a totally different kind of level of manufactured ignorance that we have to deal with. And then there's vincible ignorance, what we call vincible ignorance. It's vincible in the sense that we can overcome it, but we can overcome it only in some time in the future. So the pandemic is a good example. When the pandemic came, we were all desperately scared, and nobody knew what to do. There was no medicine. There were no vaccines. So we had to live with that ignorance till such time that research delivered us the relevant goods. But this because of the nature of post-normal times, the goods were delivered pretty speedily, because the efforts were global. People put aside their differences. Research was put on the web, right? And things could develop quite rapidly. But there will be other aspects of vincible ignorance which we will not be able to overcome so easily. In the case of climate change, for example, there are many factors that require us to kind of be aware of vincible ignorance and work on it so that we can overcome it in the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years' time. Then there is what we call invincible ignorance. The invincible ignorance is invincible because you cannot overcome it unless you change your basic assumption. And the basic assumption of the unthought, what we call the unthought of Western thought. The unthought of Western thought is that no knowledge exists outside the Western episteme. But we know there are different ways of knowing. We know there are, different kind of knowledge systems that have existed throughout history. The knowledge system we find ourselves at this moment, we think this is universal because it's dominated by a global civilization. But there are other knowledge systems. So the unthought then becomes very, very, very important. And part of what we are trying to say in post-normal times theory is that to learn to navigate these times in an appropriate way, we need to pay attention to the unthought. And the unthought demands that we actually question some of the basic assumptions and principles of Western knowledge system. So, for example, in economics, the notion of perpetual growth, we have to go beyond it. We have to move to degrowth, but we may have to think of other ways, because if we continue to grow 6%, it has been calculated. We don't just need 4 or 5 different planets. We may need 4 or 5 different solar systems. Right? Limits to Growth came out in 1972, which actually said the Earth is a finite system and we are running out of resources. How far can we continue with? So basic assumptions have to be. The idea of perpetual progress, of what indeed is progress, is essential to Western episteme, and we need to question that. The notion of efficiency. Systems have to be more and more efficient. But there is a thing called Ziauddin's paradox, which says that any system can be made efficient to a certain point. When that point is reached, no matter how hard you try to make it efficient, it becomes less and less efficient. It's known as the Ziauddin's paradox or Ziauddin's law. He came up with it in 1952, because we were studying certain systems. So we need to concentrate on the unthought, and the unthought forces us to question the basic assumptions of Western episteme. And when we do that, only then can we discover alternatives. And part of the exercise will be to bring non-Western epistemes into the mix, which provide us new ways of looking at things. There is a paper I published last year called The Smog of Ignorance, Data, Information, Knowledge, and Wisdom in Post-Normal Times. I can send it to you if you like, and that actually deals with some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Zia, and thanks, Robert. I see 2 of my colleagues who had their hands up, and I also see a third question in the chat. So I think maybe let's take a few at a time. Sanya, I saw you had your hand up, but I wasn't sure. Did you want to ask? And then Babakar?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for such a broad survey of very important random phenomena in contemporary times. Now, I wanted to ask, what would chaos theory, how does it relate to all the random phenomena you've so eloquently described? Can it be used? I know it came out several years ago. So, does it have some conceptual validity in this sort of times, chaos theory. There's a lot of what, when you, the flux and what have you, I like
normally complexity science and chaos theory are connected. When people talk about complexity, they often end up talking about chaos. From our point of view, we need to appreciate that given the drivers of change, we are going to face more and more complex situations, and complex situations often produce feedback loops, which can create chaos. And somehow we then need to learn not to move a complex system towards a chaotic system. If a complex system becomes chaotic, then of course it has, as I said, two basic outcomes. Collapses, or it creates a new order. So we will have to face this. We're going to face more and more chaotic systems. I mean, just think of how many chaotic systems we have faced in the last couple of years. Pandemic, wildfires, mass flooding, monsoon going haywire, all sorts of stuff. These are all complex and chaotic systems, and we need to learn to navigate. I don't see any other way apart from learning to deal with complex systems, and therefore chaos theory has a role to play.
Yeah, thank you, Zia, and thank you, Sanya. Yeah, I think there's that James Glick book Chaos that I remember from the late 90s. But yeah, complexity is one of my favorite subjects as well. I'm going to roll three questions into one, and then close it after that, so that you'll have another 5 minutes or so to answer these. So Babakar is asking about moving from the macro level to the micro level and looking at the individual, and then asking about what are the life strategies that the human can be equipped with to grapple liquid modernity. And then related to that in terms of, I think, responses, Liebrecht Fick is asking, from a futures thinking perspective, are there any pathways out of or visions of positive futures on the other side of these post-normal times?
Yeah.
And then lastly, Sadiq brings in a theoretical frame asking about post-humanism. There seems to be a resonance with your work in post-humanism. And are you influenced at all by post-humanism?
Let me answer the last question. Absolutely not. I'm definitely not influenced by post-humanism or transhumanism. What I am actually pointing out is that some of these guys are doing things which are beyond normal things that people, normal folks would do, or they're post-normal things. In a sense, no, there's absolutely no connection between post-humanism or transhumanism with post-normal times theory. Post-normal times theory is a theory of change. It's all about how we navigate change, and it's within the futures field, within the overarching field of future studies.
Okay.
And transhumanism and post-humanism are different kind of movements, right? With different goals. What I am pointing out is that some of the things that are leading or some people from the post-humanist background are creating more and more chaotic phenomena, and they're forcing us to redefine and rethink things. So I'm pointing that out as a real danger, rather than saying that it's a good thing, if you like. The other question was.
Well, it's the other questions are really. There's about one of them is about the any pathways out of this or visions of positive futures on the other side of it, and about the human.
It is. I think it is important to appreciate that that post-normal times theory is not, as I pointed out, end of times theory. It's not about planet is going to be burnt out, and or human beings will cease to exist, or that we will all become robots or whatever, right? Yeah. It's a transitional period. So there has to be something after the transition. And that's what we need to think. That's where visions are required, right? So what we don't have is when we are navigating post-normal times, what we are navigating towards. And that needs to be defined, and that requires what we call polylog. It's something that requires for all perspectives to come together and create a new holistic vision of the world. Right? And that is not for me to say as an individual, although I have also written a paper on it, which is contained in the World Future issue that I've described. It's called Afterthought, What Comes After Post-Normal Times. These are just my ideas, but I think it requires different perspectives to come together. That's where diversity is very, very important, and the perspective of diversity. So we call it polylogue. It's not a dialogue. It's different voices speaking often simultaneously, but they all have to be learned. So we need to have a new way of listening, in a sense, because when we have a dialogue, we can kind of listen, but when 3 or 4 people speak, we find it difficult to understand. But we need to have a new mode of listening to different perspectives, to really appreciate what diversity is about and how diversity then will create from different diverse backgrounds, we create a new holistic vision for ourselves. And we need to work towards that vision to a certain extent.
Thank you, Zia, and I hope that your response goes some way to answering Mushan Zeraviv's question as well, where he's asking about identifying patterns that mark a path out of PNT. And
yes,
I think
that's a very, 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 very good point. That's exactly what we need to do. That's exactly what we need to do. We haven't done any work on it ourselves. My group hasn't done any work on it ourselves, but that's what we need. That's what we need to do. And we're trying to identify it, but we have not gone very, very far. And if Mohsin wants to join us to do that, he'd be most welcome.
Great. Yeah, I was going to ask if, what's the best way for people to contact you through one of your websites?
They can also, the person who kind of is responsible for all this is my colleague Ziauddin Sardar. He's the well-known Spanish futurist. You can get in touch with me and I can pass it on to him, and we can we have seminars, conferences ourselves, workshops all the time. We're pushing the theory forward. We have a network meeting just to discuss particular aspects of our theory and how we're going to take it forward. And we often invite critics to come and criticize our work, so we can kind of polish it and refine it. So you're welcome to join in these workshops. Some of them, they used to be physical. Nowadays they are on webinar type stuff, but I'm hoping that within 6 months we'll go back and have kind of to physical events, and then we can invite you to some of these physical events as well.
Thank you very much, Zia. And so if anybody here goes to our HUMA website where this event was posted, you'll see links to Post-Normal Times, and it's also the word Post-Normal Times, and it's the ES is the domain .es post. Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Zia. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm so happy to have you here after having a conversation, through this year. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone else for joining us. Yeah, thanks to HUMA and UCT. And next week's speaker is Bjorn Bertelsen on the Attire Seminar Series at the same time next week, Thursday. Thanks everyone, and good night.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye for now.